The vast majority of colorless cards are artifacts. Being colorless is almost always an upside, as it makes your cards a lot easier to cast. Theoretically, just about any deck could play the majority of these cards. So today we're going to go over some of the best non-artifact colorless spells in the game. Starting us off at number 10, we have Reality Smasher. This is a 5/5 Eldrazi creature with a mana cost of 4 and 1 colorless, which requires lands that specifically tap for colorless mana. It has Trample, meaning it deals excess damage to your opponent when it attacks, Haste, meaning it can attack right away, and it has the ability where your opponent has to discard a card to target it with spells. Reality Smasher is a really nice threat, though costing 5 mana is a bit steep. Luckily for Smasher and the majority of the Eldrazi creatures, Wizards printed Eldrazi Temple and Eye of Ugin, 2 lands that gave you extra mana to play your Eldrazi. You see, the vast majority of Eldrazi were big, expensive creatures, so getting 1 extra mana to help play them was great, but didn't let you get them too much faster. You'd usually still have to wait until turn 6 at the earliest, giving your opponent ample time to respond. However, threats like Reality Smasher were able to come down as early as turn 3, leading to an absolutely busted Eldrazi beatdown deck in Modern. This deck destroyed the format until Eye of Ugin was banned. Eldrazi beatdown decks still show up from time to time in the format, as they still have access to Eldrazi Temple, and Eldrazi beatdown decks still see play in older formats where the power level is higher and Eye of Ugin is okay. Reality Smasher is a great threat for these decks, and even saw some play in the standard of its day, but it's not the best card out of the bunch. And at number 9, we have Matter Reshaper. This is a 3-tailed Eldrazi creature with a mana cost of 2 and 1 colorless, with the ability where, when it dies, you reveal the top card of your library. And if it's a permanent with a mana value of 3 or less, you can put it onto the battlefield, otherwise you put it into your hand. This is another threat for Eldrazi stomping decks, and just like Smasher, it's really easy to go +1 off of playing it. Reshaper will always draw you a card when it dies, but the ability to cheat cards directly into play is what sets this card apart. Eldrazi stompy decks play a lot of fairly expensive creatures, and Reshaper can let you cheat lands directly into play to help you cast all those expensive threats. One funny thing about Reshaper is that if it reveals another Reshaper off of its ability, it can put it into the battlefield. So if you get lucky enough, you can just chain one into the other. Reshaper basically does everything these stompy decks want. It puts out damage without really costing you any cards, and occasionally ramping you or putting another threat right into play. And at number 8, we have Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger. This is a massive 10/10 legendary Eldrazi creature with a mana cost of 10, has indestructible, so it can't be destroyed by damage or destroy effects, and it has the abilities where when you cast it, you exile 2 target permanents, and when it attacks, you exile the top 20 cards of your opponent's library. We're starting to get to the really busted cards on this list. Ulamog is a pretty crazy card if you can actually manage to cast it. And you do need to cast it, as a big part of what makes this card worth it is its cast trigger. Luckily, there are decks that excel at putting tons of mana into play. In the standard of its day, ramp decks would simply use cards like Explosive Vegetation to put as many lands into play as they could. Since then, Ulamog has mainly seen play as a threat in Tron decks. These are decks built around the 3 Urza's lands. 3 lands I can tap for a total of 7 mana if you have all 3 of them into play. These decks have been a menace in Modern for years, and Ulamog can be cast as early as turn 4 if you have 2 towers. What makes this go from great to game-winning is the fact that Ulamog can exile any 2 permanents he wants, meaning he can eat up your opponent's lands. This means that it's extremely difficult to even fight back against Ulamog. Now, Ulamog's success has been a little limited by his reliance on his cast trigger, which means he can't be used with cards like Sneak Attack to cheat him into play. Well, you can cheat him out with Sneak Attack, it isn't worth it. And at number 7, we have Ugin, the Spirit Dragon. This is a planeswalker with a starting loyalty of 7, and the abilities where you can +2 him to deal 3 damage to any target. You can -X him, which means any amount of loyalty you choose, to exile each color permanent with mana value X or less, and you can -10 him to gain 7 life, draw 7 cards, and put 7 permanents from your hand onto the battlefield. Ugin is played in a pretty similar way to Ulamog, usually being slotted into the top end of a ramp deck to come down and close out the game. Ugin can't lock your opponent out of the game by exiling their lands, but he can wipe your opponent's entire board as soon as he comes down. The -X ability is probably the most important one on this card, as without it, ramp decks would have a much harder time trying to corner and stabilize. After that, they could use a +2 to kill any threats their opponents play, or simply burn their opponent until they die. Ugin was a menace during his multiple runs through Standard, and is also a fixture of Tron decks in Modern. Though there is one planeswalker people probably associate with Tron even more. And at number 6, we have Karn Liberated. This is a 7 mana planeswalker with a starting loyalty of 6, and the abilities where you can +4 him to make your opponent exile a card from their hand, and you can -3 him to exile a target permanent, and you can -14 him to restart the game with all non-aura permanents exiled, with Karn starting the game on the battlefield under your control. Karn Liberated is kind of the face of Tron decks, and a big reason for this is his mana cost. Due to him costing exactly 7 mana, you can cast him off of one of each of the Tron lands, letting you get him out on turn 3. A turn 3 Karn Liberated is terrifying, especially on the play. There's really nothing that feels quite as bad as having your second land exiled by a Karn on your opponent's turn 3. On top of that, it's really hard to kill a resolved Karn with damage due to his +4 adding so much loyalty. A lot of the time, if you don't have a card that can specifically destroy a planeswalker, you kinda just have to let your opponent have the Karn for the rest of the game. Now, Karn isn't the most powerful cards we've talked about so far, but coming down a turn earlier in Tron decks is so important that it makes it higher up on this list anyway. And at number 5, we have Emrakul, the Promised End. This is a 13/13 legendary Eldrazi creature with a mana cost of 13, and the abilities where it costs 1 less for each card type amongst cards in your graveyard. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked by creatures without flying, trample, protection from instants, so it can't be targeted or dealt damage by instants, and whenever you cast it, you gain control of your opponent during their next turn, and they take an extra turn afterwards. Here we have a card that actually wasn't played in Tron. So, where to start with Emrakul? First off, we should mention that its cost reduction effect is even better than it looks. There are a total of 8 different card types in Magic: land, creature, instant, sorcery, artifact, enchantment, planeswalker, and tribal. If you manage to get all 8 of these into your graveyard, Emrakul will cost a measly 5 mana. The thing is, Emrakul is a fair deal for 13 mana. Getting it for any less than that is a steal. On average, Emrakul probably costs around 8 to 9 mana, which is way less than you should be paying for it. We also need to talk about just how busted the Mind Slaver effect is. Gaining control of your opponent during their turn is one of the strongest effects in the game, even better than taking an extra turn yourself a lot of the time. Just as an example, if your opponent has a nice big creature on the board and a removal spell in their hand, you could use their own removal spell to kill their creature, which would lose them 2 cards and a ton of mana. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. Not to mention, now you have a giant 13/13 in play, you can always kill at least one of your opponent's creatures by attacking into Emrakul and blocking it. Really, the extra turn afterwards is more of an insult than a way to stop Emrakul for being too good. If they took the extra turn before you gained control of them, it may have helped a little, but by the time they get to play again, all of their good cards will likely have been used by you against their own board. Emrakul is so strong it was banned from the standard format, but she hasn't seen as much play in older formats, mostly due to being difficult enough to cast and there being better options available. Currently, her home is in the sideboard of various modern decks that plan on going late enough to play it to help shore up matches where they expect the game to go long. And at number 4, we have Thought Not Seer. This is a 4/4 Eldrazi creature with a mana cost of 3 and 1 colorless, and the abilities where when it enters the battlefield, you look at your opponent's hand and exile a non-land card you find there. And when it leaves the battlefield, they draw a card. Here we have maybe the single best card in Eldrazi Stompy decks, at least on its own. Getting this card on the field on turn 2 and taking the best card of your opponent's hand is devastating. Getting a card back when they kill it does make it worse, but the thing is, the card you took from their hand is almost always much better than a random card from the top of their library. Its stat line isn't anything special for its mana cost, but being able to turbo this out on turn 2 makes the stat line far scarier. 4/4 is much higher than the stats of just about any other creature your opponent will be playing at this point in the game, aside from maybe Tarmogoyf. The combination of being able to come out so quickly and disrupting your opponent's play so much is a big part of why Eldrazi Stompy decks were so dominant. But it wasn't quite as important to the deck as the next spot on this list. And at number 3, we have Eldrazi Mimic. This is a 2/1 Eldrazi creature with a mana cost of 2, and the ability where, whenever another colorless creature enters the battlefield under your control, you can have Eldrazi Mimic's power and toughness become the same as that creature's until the end of the turn. Now, this is usually not that great of an effect. In fact, modern-day Eldrazi Tron in Modern, the descendant of old Eldrazi Stompy decks, doesn't even play the card at all. So, why is Eldrazi Mimic so high on this list? Well, because it is the perfect card to play alongside Eye of Ugin. And as we mentioned earlier, Eye is a land that makes all of your Eldrazi creatures cost 2 less to cast, and you can also pay 7 and tap it to tutor up colorless creature cards. So, if you have an Eye of Ugin on the field, all of your Eldrazi Mimics are completely free. What people would do is play Eye on turn 1, dump all of the Mimics onto the battlefield, and then on their next turn, play Eldrazi Temple and cast Thought Not Seer. This would let them rip the best card out of their opponent's hand and deal up to 16 damage to their opponent. And given the prevalence of fetch lands and shock lands in Modern, which require you to pay 3 life to get an untapped land onto the field, so 16 is basically enough to kill someone in that format. This led to so many turn 3 kills that Eldrazi Mimic basically forced Wizard to ban Eye of Ugin from Modern. You see, the release of Eldrazi Mimic and the rest of the Eldrazi cards in Oath of the Gatewatch ushered in an era in Magic called Eldrazi Winter. What had happened was two very popular decks, Splinter Twin and Amulet decks, had just been hit on the last ban list, with Splinter Twin and Summer Bloom having been banned. So not only was the deck way too good, but there were a lot of players that were looking for a new deck right at the time the deck came out. This led to one of the largest overrepresentations of a single deck in the history of Modern. So it was kind of a foregone conclusion that Eye of Ugin was going to be banned. Eye of Ugin was just way too good of an effect, as long as you actually have good cards to use it on. Really, the biggest reason why Eye of Ugin isn't banned in Legacy is that the best 2-mana creatures to cast it off is Eldrazi Mimic, which again, usually isn't all that impressive. And at number 2, we have Karn the Great Creator. This is a planeswalker with a mana cost of 4 and a starting loyalty of 5. It has the abilities where your opponent can't activate the activated abilities of artifacts they control. You can +1 it to make target non-creature artifact a creature with the stats equal to its mana value until the end of the turn, and you can -2 Karn to grab an artifact from your exile or from your sideboard and put it into your hand. Now, the thing that makes Karn really good is its -2 ability. You see, especially in the early days of the game, artifacts were kind of busted. And even now, there are a ton of great artifacts that this card can find you. The best one, before it got banned anyway, was Mycosynth Lattice. This was a 6-mana artifact with a bunch of abilities, but the important one was turning all permanents on the field into artifacts. With both Karn and Lattice on the field, your opponent just couldn't tap their lands for mana, because tapping for mana is an activated ability, and they're all artifacts now. This usually wouldn't be too good, but what made it broken was the fact that Karn could grab it from your sideboard with its -2, making this a 1-card combo that just stopped your opponent from playing the game. This was so good that Mycosynth Lattice got banned from Modern. This really didn't slow Karn down at all, though, as people were still using it to find tons of great artifacts. Cards like Ensnaring Bridge can be used to stop creature decks in their tracks, or find Tormod's Crypt to punish graveyard effects, or with Liquid Metal Coating to turn their opponent's lands into artifacts, and then use Karn's +1 to turn it into a 0/0 creature to blow it up. Meaning Karn is still wrecking mana bases even without Lattice. And that's just with the artifacts that are legal in formats like Legacy and Modern. In Vintage, where artifacts are really busted, this card is restricted to 1 for being way too good. Now, Karn is a really strong card, but I don't think he's quite as meta-warping as the number 1 spot on this list, though it is very close. And at number 1, we have Emrakul, the Aeons Torn. This is a 15/15 legendary Eldrazi with a mana cost of 15, and the abilities where it can't be countered. When you cast it, you take an extra turn, Flying, protection from all colored spells, Annihilator 6, meaning when it attacks, your opponent sacrifices 6 permanents, and when it's put into your graveyard, you shuffle your graveyard back into your library. Emrakul is one of the 2 scariest creatures in the entire game, with Griselbrand being the other game-winning creature that people love to cheat out. Emrakul is just a little too expensive to realistically try to cast, but luckily there are tons of ways to cheat onto the battlefield without paying the cost. The most popular are Show and Tell and Sneak Attack. Together, these cards form the backbone of the Legacy deck called Sneak and Show. It's worth mentioning that Sneak Attack only lets you have Emrakul on your field for a single turn, as it forces you to sacrifice it at the end of your turn. Even 1 turn with Emrakul is enough to win, as a single swing will destroy your opponent's board and leave them with next to no life. Emrakul isn't as generically useful as a card like Karn, but considering how many archetypes I built around cheating exactly into play, it's certainly the most powerful colorless spell in the game, and her influence on the metagame of formats like Legacy is equally immense. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, go ahead and leave those down in a comment down below.